Thanks for tuning in. I'm Han Da-eun in Seoul. It's been a busy week for President Yoon Suk-yeol after holding talks with New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon earlier this week. He held a summit with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in Seoul today as the two leaders continued their efforts to maintain a cordial Seoul-Tokyo relationship. The summits came as South Korea faces evolving security challenges on the Korean peninsula, in the Indo-Pacific region, and beyond. In today's episode of Within the Frame, we look into the summit outcomes and their significance with Kiim Yang-gyu, principal researcher at the East Asia Institute. It's always great to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Bruce Klingner, senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, as always, for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, Dr. Kim, let's start off with you. Let's first discuss the purpose of Kishida's visit to South Korea. Why did he seek a 12th summit with President Yoon just before stepping down?
Well, I think this is a perfect question to start with. According to what we hear from President Yoon's office, Prime Minister Kishida's visit to South Korea is a pivotal moment to review the progress made through this shuttle diplomacy just you mentioned and discuss the future cooperation before he steps down. This visit isn't just about reflecting on past achievements, but also about setting future course for bilateral, regional, and global collaborations. Many might not remember, but in 2006, Prime Minister Koizumi made a symbolic visit to Graceland, the home of Elvis Presley, with the previous President George W. Bush. And Koizumi was a huge Elvis fan, and it was Bush's way of thanking Koizumi for his strong support of the U.S.-Japan alliance, especially during the Iraq War, which was politically sensitive in Japan. So the Graceland visit symbolized the personal and political bond between the two leaders and solidified the U.S.-Japan alliance as Koizumi prepared to step down. Similarly, Kishida's visit to Seoul carries a sense of closure, but this time it might be Kishida who owes gratitude to President Yoon. Yoon's bold move to address forced labor compensation has been crucial in renewing relations between the two countries. And despite facing domestic criticism, Yoon has taken politically risky steps to improve ties with Japan, while Tokyo's response has remained cautious so far. It's clear the rest of the cup has yet to be filled. The summit presents the opportunity for Kishida to reciprocate in a meaningful way. While some speculate that Kishida's visit might be motivated by a desire to maintain influence within his party as a kingmaker, and I believe his commitment to the strengthening Seoul-Tokyo ties is genuine, especially since Camp David Trilateral Summit. President Yoon's diplomatic efforts have been significant, and Kishida's reciprocation with substantial measures could ensure that this positive momentum continues beyond his tenure.
Well, President Yoon, during opening remarks today prior to the summit, acknowledged that challenging issues remain between Seoul and Tokyo, but expressed hopes that the two neighbors will keep up the hard-sought momentum of cordial relations and work closer together towards a future-oriented relationship. And as you mentioned, Dr. Kim, Kishida's visit clearly reflects his will to express gratitude towards all of President Yoon's efforts. Now, Dr. Klingner, reviewing achievements made in Seoul-Tokyo bilateral cooperation was one of the main purposes of Kishida's visit. How do you assess the progress made by the leaders of Korea and Japan? And just as a side note, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell thinks that President Yoon deserves a Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, there really have been quite outstanding achievements since President Yoon's very bold, though politically risky move last year. But we've seen a resumption of bilateral South Korean-Japanese security, diplomatic, economic meetings, as well as initiatives that had really been frozen for a number of years. And then in conjunction with the United States, we've also seen very strong progress on trilateral issues, which were encapsulated in the Camp David agreements a year ago and then affirmed recently with a trilateral security agreement. So what we've seen is particularly on security issues, a resumption of military exercises, the large-scale U.S.-South Korea military exercises, and then the trilateral military exercises. So Deterrence of the three countries has now been strengthened, and the agreement to exchange real-time information on North Korean missile launches enables all three countries to be more secure. So South Korea is now better protected because of the exchange with Japanese and U.S. missile exchange information. So we've also seen a commitment by all three leaders to strengthen economic cooperation, to diversify away from an over-reliance on trade with China, supply chain guarantees. So really across the board, it's been very beneficial to all three countries, and really would not have been able to have those achievements had President Yoon not made his initiative in 2023.
And we'll talk more about South Korea, U.S.-Japan security ties as we move on. But before that, thorny issues still remain, Dr. Klingner, which include the issue of Japan's wartime forced labor. For our viewers who may not be so up to date on this issue, can you give us a quick recap on the progress made on this issue, and also your take on whether Kishida will show a more sincere approach during his visit?
The South Korean Supreme Court has ruled that Japanese companies that used forced labor during the occupation would need to pay compensation to the victims. Japan responded that that would violate the 1965 treaty, which normalized diplomatic relations between the two companies, and so there was an impasse. And then President Yoon in 2023 came up with a solution to try to have a more forward-looking relationship with Tokyo, where a foundation predominantly of South Korean companies would provide compensation to the South Korean victims. Japanese companies were allowed to provide compensation, but I don't believe any have done so, although on a separate education fund for future development of bilateral relations, Japanese companies have provided donations to that. But President Yoon's initiative, although it was heavily criticized in South Korea, did enable the restoration of ties between the two countries, as we've been discussing, and enabled a more forward-looking initiative. So the U.S. welcomed the initiative. We've long been pushing the two allies to seek to focus on the threats of this millennium. And given the North Korean and Chinese threats, which are very dire and rising, it enabled a much greater focus on the threats of this millennium.
Kishida has reportedly said during the summit that it's heartbreaking that many Koreans had to go through difficult and painful experiences in the past, but he adhered to his position that he will succeed previous Japanese government's stance regarding Seoul-Tokyo historical feud. So we're still waiting for more details to come out of the summit and the press briefing that followed. And we'll also see how his visit and his remarks made will be received by the South Korean public. Now, Dr. Kim, some are questioning the practicality of the farewell summit between Yoon and Kishida. From your perspective, would the summit outcome meet the expectations of the Korean public that have largely been quite upset after Japan's listing of the Sado mine with UNESCO?
Well, I think it's now confirmed that this summit will lead to some practical outcomes, like the signing of memorandum of understanding for establishing a bilateral cooperation mechanism to facilitate joint efforts in evacuating citizens from conflict-zone in third countries, and like the shortening the immigration screening process for South Korean visitors. While many may downplay these steps as minor, but I think they represent a good start, especially in the context of public opinion data. And according to the regression analysis of the East Asia Institute's annual public opinion survey on South Korea's perception of Japan, those who have visited Japan are significantly more likely to hold favorable views of the country, and this correlation has been statistically significant year after year. Of course, correlation doesn't imply causation, and it's possible that people who already have a positive view of Japan are more inclined to visit. However, the general principle holds true, and personal and cultural exchange are key to fostering better understanding between the nations, and these measures can contribute to that. That said, if the question is whether these steps are enough to meet the broader expectation of the South Korean public, those waiting for Japan to fill the rest of the cup? I have to say, unfortunately, no. According to EI survey this year, which will be released after Chuseok holiday, the only group supporting President Yoon's Japan policy are those who subscribe to the functionalist view. They believe that future-oriented functional cooperation in areas like security, economy, and environment will gradually help resolve historical issues between the two countries. However, the majority of Koreans do not subscribe to this view. This is why Yoon's Japan policy remains unpopular domestically. A large portion of South Korean public feels that the real tipping point in strengthening bilateral relations can only be reached when Japan takes a bold move on historical justice and territorial issues, whether that's addressing forced labor, comfort women, history textbooks, just Korean sharing, or Dokdo. And I truly hope that Prime Minister Kishida, during his last visit summit with President Yoon, can make some meaningful and bold steps, but I don't think it happened this time.
As you pointed out, the two leaders signed an agreement that will allow South Korea and Japan to work together when evacuating their citizens from third countries during emergencies. And they also saw eye to eye on the need to simplify immigration procedures for citizens of both countries to further seek people-to-people exchanges. But as you pointed out, we don't know for sure if that's enough, right? Dr. Klingner, strengthened South Korea, U.S., Japan trilateral security ties are hailed as one of President Yoon's key diplomatic achievements, as you briefly mentioned. But with upcoming leadership changes, questions are arising about the future of this trilateral framework. Can it withstand the challenges ahead?
Well, there are always questions, and that's why the three leaders have been trying to really regularize and institutionalize the improvement in coordination and cooperation that we've seen in the last year and a half. The first election that comes up is in Japan. Prime Minister Kishida said he would not run for re-election as president of the ruling party, which means he will not maintain being prime minister. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty as to who will be his replacement, which will be announced later this month. A larger than regular number of candidates have announced their quest to be the new prime minister. But really on foreign and security policies, whoever is selected will not alter Japanese policies of the strong focus on the relationship and the alliance with the United States, the need to improve coordination against common security threats. The one concern would be that some of the Japanese candidates, the more conservative, even more nationalist candidates, might not be as enthusiastic as Prime Minister Kishida to maintain or expand relations between South Korea and Japan, and that would be of concern to Washington. The next election would be the United States, but neither former President Trump or Vice President Harris would move away from the focus on strengthening our alliances. There's some differences between the two candidates, but all would affirm the need to improve relations between our two critically important allies in Northeast Asia. The largest impact would be on a South Korean presidential election, which is not for some time. If a progressive candidate won, they tend to be more nationalistic and might try to inflame relations with Tokyo by focusing on the past rather than focusing on the future and the need to address common challenges and threats, as well as improve common opportunities between the three countries.
And moving on to another summit held this week, the leaders of South Korea and New Zealand held a summit in Seoul on Wednesday, agreeing to elevate bilateral relations to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Dr. Kim, how do you evaluate the outcome, and what does it mean for President Yoon's Indo-Pacific strategy?
Right. President Yoon and Prime Minister Luxon agreed to elevate ROK-New Zealand relation to a comprehensive strategic partnership, and both leaders emphasize that the two countries are like-minded partners committed to share principles such as upholding democracy, preserving the rule of law, supporting multilateral organizations, free trade, and sustainable growth. And they also agreed to deepen cooperation in areas like trade, multilateral institutions, natural disaster response, education, monitoring North Korea's evasion of UN sanctions, denuclearization of DPRK, climate change, and South China Sea, among others. While these areas of cooperations are significant, and the emphasis remains largely on non-strategic issues. New Zealand's role in South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy has been relatively marginal, and even when mentioned, it is often grouped with countries like Australia, ASEAN, or NATO, rather than emphasized as a principal partner in an independent manner. This reflects its lower priority in Seoul's foreign policy, and one reason for this is New Zealand's late adoption of Indo-Pacific concept in 2021 and its longstanding identity as a Pacific power. And New Zealand has historically taken a cautious approach on China issues and has a complex domestic demographic mix, including Maori, Pacific Island, European influence, and Asian migrants. That influences its foreign policy as well. And notably, New Zealand suspended the U.S. security guarantees under ANZUS in the 1980s due to its strong commitment to being a nuclear-free nation. And for some time, it was viewed as a weak link in the Five Eyes alliance due to its strategic ambiguity on China. However, New Zealand is now shifting from its earlier assumption of a benign strategic environment where China was a primarily economic partner and the U.S. provided security. Its consideration of involvement in Pillar 2 of AUKUS demonstrates that New Zealand is pivoting toward a more strategic role. And I believe that in the coming years, we will see greater alignment between South Korea and New Zealand, and the depth of their strategic cooperation will gradually become more prominent.
And the U.S. has long sought to institutionalize the grouping of South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, NATO's four Indo-Pacific partners, known as the IP4. Dr. Klingner, as these countries enter a period of heightened engagement, what do you foresee for their future security cooperation?
As you point out, the U.S. has long sought to not only institutionalize the trilateral relationship with Japan and South Korea against the North Korean threat, but also expand cooperation amongst Indo-Pacific partners against the very dire and growing China threat. Nations have tended to be a bit more hesitant in risking Beijing's anger in working together, but the Biden administration has sought to create what they call a lattice work of cooperation amongst allies and partners throughout the Indo-Pacific. And we've seen progress on that. Japan and Australia have been very forthright in their criticism of Beijing for its human rights violations, as well as its intimidating efforts and policies against neighbors in the East and South China Sea, its efforts to intimidate Taiwan. South Korea, even under the Yoon administration, has been much more hesitant to criticize Beijing while calling for stability in the Taiwan Straits. South Korea, unlike the United States, Japan, and Australia, doesn't even identify Beijing as the perpetrator of those actions. So President Yoon has pledged that South Korea will assume a larger security role in the Indo-Pacific. And I think some actions have been taken, but still sort of lagging behind other nations in the region. So we're urging that all nations work together against that growing Chinese threat. And I think we'll see cooperation, some of it sort of below the surface, as nations may be still hesitant to risk China's anger in what Beijing sees as a containment policy. Instead, the U.S. sees it as like-minded nations working together against a common threat. Not only the security threat from China, but also the economic threat in that Beijing seeks to intimidate smaller nations in the region to accommodate Beijing's wishes.
And our final point of discussion today, Dr. Kim, President Yoon is expected to visit the Czech Republic later this month as part of efforts to finalize a mega nuclear reactor contract. Now, hurdles remain, though, such as the legal action from the U.S.-based Westinghouse, which has filed an appeal to the Czech anti-monopoly office against the Czech government's selection of a South Korean firm for the nuclear plant building project. What would President Yoon bring home from the visit?
Right. The deal in question is 24 trillion won nuclear power plant project, and the Czech Office for the Protection of Competition has begun official procedures in response to objections from the US-based Westinghouse, as you just mentioned, and France's Electricité de France, EDF, concerning South Korea's bid. And Westinghouse has raised the intellectual property rights as well, their concerns due to its historical involvement in constructing South Korea's first nuclear power plants. And while EDF has claimed that the tender conditions were violated, and it has requested contracts cancellation. And this isn't the first time Westinghouse has raised such concerns, and simulation occurred during the South Korea's successful nuclear deal with the UAE in 2009. And at the time, South Korea opted for cooperation, working with Westinghouse on plant installation. This suggests that South Korea has experience in managing these kinds of disputes diplomatically. As for EDF's complaint, I think it is worth noting that EDF has a poor track record when it comes to meeting delivery schedules and staying within cost parameters, which might weaken their case. What's more important is broader context of the President Yoon's visit. During a recent meeting with Czech National Security Advisor Tomáš Pojar, President Yoon, it was made clear that the Czech Republic is seeking comprehensive cooperation beyond just nuclear energy, and that the Czech government is interested in collaboration across sectors like industry, investment, defense, and transportation. And this is why the heads of the South Korean largest conglomerates, Jung Il-sung, Lee Jae-yong, Choi Tae-won, Gu Gang-mo, are accompanying President Yoon on this visit. And their presence signals South Korea's commitment to broader long-term economic and industrial cooperation with the Czech government. Given this comprehensive approach and diplomatic and business muscle behind President Yoon's visit, I think it's likely that the nuclear power deal will be concluded during his visit.
President Yoon's trip to the Czech Republic, another trip of high significance to keep close tabs on. We'll leave our discussion there. Very timely and meaningful discussions we had today. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Dr. Klingner, as always, for your perspectives.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time next week. We'll be back with more, same time next Monday. Have a great weekend.